The golden mean, or rule of thirds, as photographers like to work with, is probably one of the most important elements that we can work with in order to create great compositions. It's something that is very natural, but it does help us to be able to incorporate all the elements of a photograph in order to make it look fantastic. Composition is the combination of so many different elements of what we're looking at. It's the colour, it's the form, shape, two different things. It's textures, and it's also, of course, space. It's making use of the space in a way which will finally create a photograph which will be of great interest to the person looking at it, or just ourselves as photographers. In photography, most people talk about the rule of thirds. In the world of art, a much more complex way of looking at images is through the golden mean, which is a ratio of 1 to 1.618, which creates two different forms, which in fact have a volume which is exactly the same volume, but they just look different. This is the reason why we can take photos in portrait form or landscape form, meaning long ways or upright, and that can give us new ideas about how to create compositions. In my opinion, there's a bit too much heaviness on the landscape form, believing that it's the correct way. Using the portrait form of holding your camera to take a photograph can actually brighten up the thoughts in your mind and give you new ideas about composition. The wonderful thing about the golden mean ratio, or the rule of thirds, is that in fact it's very natural to us. It's how we look at the world around us. Everything we see, we can divide it up into the rule of thirds or into the golden mean ratio. And we can put spirals in there, we can put square blocks in there to create the ratios. Just try it by looking at architecture especially, which is handmade by people, thought out by architects and engineers, and you'll see the golden mean is everywhere. You'll see the rule of thirds is everywhere. It's just how we see the world. And the most important thing for the human mind to do is to make order of what we look at. And we do this naturally. So we can find it in every element of nature and the things we make. And for some reason, we're drawn to it like a magnet. And it's what pleases the eye when we find a lovely photograph that really interests us. We can easily see the rule of thirds or the golden mean. And the thing about this is it's so natural in us, it's so evolutionary that we don't need to really think about it too much when we're creating a photograph. But to be aware of it can give us great opportunities to create balance and weight in a photograph. But to be aware of the rule of thirds helps us to be able to place certain elements of what we're looking at in certain positions within the rule of thirds when we're looking through the viewfinder on a camera, and to be able to just push it to the edge of one of the grids in order to create more weight. And therefore we can just about push something to the edge of one of the rule of thirds lines or on the grid. And in this way, possibly create with an element within the image, we can create some type of balance, imbalance, or weight, which creates tension. One of the wonderful things about images in painting or photography, if you look at them, you find that there is a tension. It's part of the psychology of images and why we find them so fascinating and interesting, and why some of them are just real humdingers that just make us flabbergasted when we look at them, is because it creates events in our mind, in our psychology. The mind responds very, very much to the idea of tension and weight and balance when we look at a photograph. And it gives us a sense of well-being, and maybe sometimes a sense of, I don't know, not feeling too good about ourselves when we see a photo that can, for some reason, some abstract reason, make us feel uncomfortable. As photographers, most of us who maybe do street photography or still life or landscape, what we're looking for is photos that are harmonious. And so we're using the rule of thirds in order to create lovely, harmonious photos. One particular photo which I took at the beginning of spring, I believe, was late evening as the sun was going down, and I had the reflections coming off of the building behind me, and I saw a lovely composition framed by the arch of a building, or rather not an arch, it's a square square causeway, walkway, whatever you like to call it, which would lead from one main street to another main street. And there were several people inside of there, and luckily the reflections from the building actually did reflect into the room area that I was looking at, and that way the colour could be illuminated by these reflections. I do find that the figure of the person wearing the colourful clothes, the jeans and hat, and looking at her telephone, that's the centre of my photo. That is the interest point. There's something about her, her form, her figure. It's a human being, and we're immediately attracted to the human being in the photo. She doesn't take up much of the photo at all, but the structure around her, the shadows, the textures, and the light, this is composition. And all of these things seem to balance very well together. And so I'm quite pleased with it. It was the last photo of the day. I was standing on the opposite side of a fairly narrow main street and just waiting to see what would happen on that corner. And it was something about the light. And again, here comes the unconscious part of street photography, is I wasn't thinking, oh, light is bouncing off the building behind me. I was rather thinking the light is rather subtle and strange in that corner, and I like it. And when people walk past, that evening light was picking up the colours and creating much more vibrance and creating a little bit of texture, even from I'd say about 20 metres away or less, 15 metres away. And there were two people at a cash machine, and all of them seemed to be well lit, but in evening light. And so I took probably 2 shots and said, time to go home. But as you can see, the photo did seem to turn out quite well. I like it very much. And it was a lovely moment for me. But while I took it, there was a lot of tension in me, which was very positive tension, because as I looked through the viewfinder, I was balancing certain elements and including and discluding certain elements of the building. Also, especially below their feet, how much street I would include or not. And at the same time, quickly looking above to see how much of the building above I was including, because what's above their heads can be interesting, but can soon turn into not relevant, too much building. And I was using, I believe, a 50mm lens, and so there was no chance of zooming in and out or anything like that. But I do think it turned out very well, and there's so many elements in it which you could refer to as a little bit of colour composition, most definitely beautiful subtle light, and the way that they are in fact in a very shadowy area, but I was successful in getting a good street shot there. But nevertheless, it turned out well for me. I'm looking for another moment like that.